When
not
the
them as a
Arabs took
people.
white slaves back in the day, was that systemic racism against white people?
I mean, I really don't have an answer to that. I mean, I'd say mostly in America. In America
is
as a
that?
whole.
We're talking about systemic racism. Um, Obviously, signs are pretty reductionist, but basically, my point is, I actually believe in systemic racism, but I do think it's mostly against like whites and Asians in society today. So that's my position. What are your thoughts on systemic racism? Why do you disagree with the sign?
Well, I just say really look at America's history as
Mm-hmm.
a whole. The whole country in itself is built on colonialism, white supremacy. Pretty much that was the model. That's what it was supposed to be. If you look back at anything from the 17th century, you can tell that that's what they were going for. So when they brought the slaves over, when they started letting Asian immigrant workers started coming over, it started really veering its head that that's what America was supposed to be. It was supposed to be this white nationalist state under God, American, pure blood. That's what it was supposed to be. So when it started changing, of course they tried to put laws in place that made those people less likely to move there or go there, like the Asian Exclusion Act.
The Chinese Exclusion Act.
Chinese
Yeah.
Exclusion Act. And then you have slavery as a whole, and then right after that, Jim Crow. So it's not very hard to see. I mean, I'm not an outsider. I grew up here. I very much obvious of it, but when you look at it, you can't just purely say it doesn't exist because it's ingrained in America's history, and it will probably continue to be. Because one thing about me, about racism, it doesn't go away. It changes and it morphs into something different. Just like back in the mid like 90s, it was totally okay to go up to people and call them slurs and call them whatever you wanted to because it was acceptable at the time to do that. But now when you look at modern times and now, it's more of a discreet kind of hateful vibe. So instead of, calling black people the N-word or calling them all types of words that they call them thugs, they call them criminals now. When Asians were discriminated for coming to the U.S., they called them job stealers, all of that. And now, well, there's a whole different thing, with the model minority kind of thing. But I won't go that route because that's not relevant. But they have been they've been criticized just as much. So I just say, if you want to be that ignorant about America's history, then sure, you can agree with that. But I feel like anyone could take a deep dive into America's politics and history in general and just see that obviously that was the case.
Sure. So, you gave me a lot of historical examples, and I would agree. I would say historically, all of those things are true as far as Chinese Exclusion Act, slavery, Jim Crow, etc. But we're talking about today, as far as systemic racism. You say it doesn't ever go away; it kind of changes, which seems to be a very pessimistic view of the future, and saying we're basically doomed to have this problem forever and ever. So a lot of people would say, what's even the point of trying to solve it if it just, you can't ever do anything about it? But I would say, what are concrete examples you have today of systemic racism today?
It can mostly be just the little things, some of the policies that some of the initiatives that have been active, during COVID, perhaps, the huge increase in anti-Asian sentiment and all of that, and governments even the U.S. government even kind of backing it with Trump kind of antagonizing it and saying, instead of calling it the coronavirus, he called it the Chinese virus. And then it kind of multituded into the whole country in itself saying, oh yeah, that's true. And, Asian crimes went up by over 200%. People were being hate crimed. People were being people were being assaulted, people were getting racially profiled and attacked.
This is a great example. So first of all, even in the beginning, I told you I think systemic racism is real, but I think it's mostly towards white and Asian people. Well, we can get back to other stuff too, but I want to talk about this example in particular. So, Trump calling it the China virus or the Chinese coronavirus. This is what CNN and other outlets were calling it earlier on too. Wuhan coronavirus. A lot of times we call viruses, based on where they came from. That's been the case. They called it like German measles or whatever. Spanish flu. Like these are historically we would call things this way. Chinese. Some people say, hate crimes like went up significantly, etc. Do you know who the primary suspects were in the physical attacks against Chinese people during that time?
I hate to say it, but I know that the black community.
It was a lot of black people attacking the Chinese community.
You want to know about that? There's nothing more bliss than black ignorance. There are some people in the black community.
Do you think it was ignorance, or is it like there's that rap song? I forget who it's by, but he goes. Find a house and scope it out, find a Chinese neighborhood because they don't believe in bank accounts. So they believe like Chinese people disproportionately carry more cash on them. So if they rob them, they can make,
I feel like I've heard that verse before.
Yeah, I forget the name of the rapper. I've included it in my video called the real face behind Asian hate. So if people want to check that out. But.
Yeah, it's not a good thing because I feel like what happens mostly is black people kind of see themselves as the martyr of it all because, racism starting out, it's almost always, if you notice it all around the world, black people aren't very liked, even in places where you wouldn't even see them and even in places where they probably would never be. I always found it interesting looking into other regions and other languages and other religions and seeing so much colorist and kind of anti-black sentiments from regions that would probably never even see a black person. Like, there are laws in certain Asian countries with certain foreigners where, they can't get certain amends from the government and stuff because, they're a foreigner, they're not accepted. But then there's also the sentiments of really the black stereotypes in general. When you see a black person in a traditional place where you don't see black people, the only thing people have
YG.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Well, you get.
But if we could keep it focused on America, I understand. Obviously, I wouldn't disagree that there's systemic racism, even potentially against black people against other countries. But for this example, we're talking about America. So, we talked about the Asian thing, which I agree. I think whites and Asians there's systemic racism against. But when it comes to blacks in particular, like what are some examples you see of systemic racism against the black community?
Well, we could go about the Crown Act. We could talk about that a little bit. So the Crown Act was an act that was passed in government pretty much to stop workplace discrimination against black people against their hair and the way that they appear. So if you look at my hair right now, I kind of just have it out and twist it up, and I'd go to work like this. And I know back then you can get discriminated against for
back when.
Way. I mean, not back then. Maybe about it's probably the mid and about the 1900s, about that time.
Okay, but I was talking about today.
I mean,
what are some examples today?
Yeah, about nowadays. So there was an example. I can't remember. A couple years ago, there was this little black girl, and she was in a wrestling contest, and the wrestling coach found her hair to be unacceptable. She had her hair in braids, and the coach said, "Hey, you can't have her hair like that." Even though, to be honest, that's the best protective style to keep it in, because if she were to wear it out, it would be out, and it could be pulled. So it's the best way to just braid it down so it won't be in the way.
Sure, I don't mean to I'm kind of interrupting, but again, we're talking about systemic racism. That sounds like an individual case.
Well, I feel like
on a systemic level, what are some examples of systemic racism?
It kind of goes more into it because it's not the only instance, and it was this actual. And then if you go more into the story, they actually cut the little girl's hair, and against her permission, and they cut her hair. So this isn't the only instance, and there were times in government where this was an acceptable thing to do, or you could fire black people for certain things, for certain hairstyles that they wore. Like there's a bunch of workplace discriminations where they didn't find certain black people's appearance for especially more higher end business jobs. They didn't find them professional enough because the hair that they had didn't scream professional. When you look at my hair, some people would be like, that's not a very clean way to keep your hair. You could probably do it better. And it's systemic because, in businesses, it's a well-known fact that black people in interview processes such as for higher businesses or just management places aren't taken that seriously because they would think, oh, well, you're black, the way you present yourself isn't seen as our company model, what we normally would go for. So, that's why straighteners and relaxers became way more dominant in the workplace for black people and black women specifically because they didn't want to cause a fuss about their hair, and they didn't want an upper manager to come and say something about it.
Sure, but so far I'm not seeing any references to systems that are in place or statistics around hiring when it comes to hair.
The system in itself is there because it's not just in one place. It was mostly the whole business world, and applicants could apply and they could have a stereotypically black name and they would already not even be considered for the application.
Oh, is that the Lakeisha and Jamal study?
The Lakeisha Jamal study, yeah. So there was this woman, I actually saw this on TikTok.
But on the Lakeisha and Jamal study, that when they switched out the names for when they controlled for the names, because those are more not just stereotypically black names, but they're also stereotypically more lower class black names.
Yes.
So they didn't use more higher class names like Jaden and Nia, for example. And also reflected in the statistics currently today, we're seeing black people at S&P 100 companies being hired disproportionately, compared to the general population, and as well as white people. I think in 2021, the S&P 100 hired 90. They're claiming 94% people of color, of which 24% were black, which blacks are only about 12% of the population, so double the representation of themselves in the population, and they only hired 6% white people. So how is that not discrimination against white people systemically?
Well, I have an opinion on that mostly, but I feel like it's not appropriate to
No,
say.
please, go ahead.
I don't really feel like white people can be discriminated against.
How so?
The system in itself is built around them. The system was built for them. I don't really believe in a system that can oppress the intended oppressor, because in a perfect world, if America didn't become how it is now and it stuck to its roots, they probably would never even face that.
Is there any country where white people could be oppressed, in your opinion?
There could be some that have more indigenous roots to them. So maybe around Australia, the native Australians, they face a lot of discrimination from actual Australian people.
Well, those aren't white people.
Well,
though.
Yeah, those aren't considered white people. But it's hard.
They don't even look white.
Yeah, they don't even look white. But I mean, that's the closest.
Aboriginals
that's the closest example I can find. But
those
I
aren't
don't,
white people. What's an example of white people? You don't think white people can be discriminated against anywhere in the world?
I mean, mostly I can't really.
Are Jews white?
I feel like Jews. That's a more religion kind of thing, but there's also more. There's also ethnicity behind it, but for most of them, I say the racism they exude, it's mostly from an actual sentiment of the hate of their religion in itself. And
when the Arabs took white slaves back in the day, was that systemic racism against white people?
I mean, I really don't have an answer to that. I mean, I say mostly in America as a whole. It's not. I will never see, because my American point of view is that they've always been the higher power in most places. So I don't really see how.
But if that changes, my point is, if that starts to change and there are literally just laws. For example, when you go to university, blacks above whites get, I think, somewhere around a 310 point boost in their score effectively when it comes to admissions, so that black people are awarded despite getting total meritocracy, they're awarded beyond whites and Asians even more. It's a 450 point boost above Asians. Is that not systemic discrimination? It's literally just done.
Well, I say they do that mostly because black people and Asian people in the country, especially in colleges, have been underrepresented. Shit, back in the
No,
1970s.
they're discriminating against Asians. That's
I
what
mean,
I'm saying.
well, oh
Like-
yeah. Oh, you said
Like
discriminate.
like worse again, like whites, like Asians have to do better than white people by about like 100 something points, I think.
Well, because then there's also the stereotype that they're smarter than the other
That's
races.
not reflected.
so-
That's not reflected in the statistics.
I mean, I don't think it is verbatim.
It absolutely is. They score higher on like SAT scores and everything.
Well, I feel like that's a conception that most people have always kind of had, though.
But it's a reality. Like it's just shown in the test scores.
Well, as I said, do they have to do better than white people? I mean,
they do, like, score wise. They have higher
I
rates
don't
of
really-
PhDs and
I'm saying-
everything.
I can really only reflect on the black experience because that's what I am. That's my identity. I can't speak much on. That's why I didn't speak most on Asian, because I don't understand it to the best extent as an Asian would. I can really only speak on my experience and the black community and other black experiences. So that's why I normally don't bring up other minorities in this, because I don't understand it to the extent. And I'm a computer science major. This isn't my area of expertise. I only really stay in where I would know and where I'm familiar. So, like, even when I brought up the Chinese Exclusion Act, it was only because I knew of it because I learned it in AP U.S. history. I didn't go out and know that verbatim. Because it's not really it's not my community, and it didn't affect me per se, and it didn't affect my group of people. So that's really the main basis of information that I know. So I'm sorry if I don't satisfy the answers for other minority groups, but I really can't speak for them.
Sure. Is there anything else?
I mean, I was a little scared to come over here. I know that based off the whole thing, you're trying to get people to come and talk to you, and obviously I don't know everything. I'm interested by these topics, but I'm not an expert in them, and I kind of just spoke my mind about what I know. And
Did you learn anything interesting that you're gonna like ruminate on? Or
I mean, I want to learn more about the Asian experience and how they attribute certain discriminations, because I really only know of the black experience. I really only know about the disparities that my community and I could possibly face. So I know of other minorities that can face other issues, but I don't know them as in depth as I would know as a black experience, because I live it every day. I can't sit in their shoes and tell them how it is, because we experience two completely different things. We live in two completely different worlds. So, but I will say that I'll look more into it and try to be a little bit more informed about it, but I normally don't step in that realm because I don't want to say something that comes off-putting or disingenuous, because trust me, I know about people trying to speak for you and being very disingenuous about it and not even understanding it verbatim, but I try to tend to stay away from it because I can't represent them to the way that they need to be. So
Sure.
I can only really speak out for certain issues and give awareness, but I can't go and talk about it verbatim and tell other people what they should feel and how they should feel. That's not my place, and I wouldn't appreciate if someone else did that to me, because that's not their place and they wouldn't know how it is.